August 1944. A room in German intelligence headquarters, Eastern France. The message had arrived 30 minutes ago. No one had spoken since. Officers stood around the table, maps spread flat beneath yellow lamplight. Cigarette smoke hung motionless in the air. Pins marked defensive positions that no longer existed. The breakthrough was confirmed. Before we begin this story, please show some love by subscribing to the channel. It's quick, simple, and incredibly appreciated. Don't forget to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Allied forces had punched through the Falaise sector. German divisions were pulling back in chaos. The entire defensive structure, built over weeks, reinforced at enormous cost, had collapsed in 72 hours. One officer leaned over the map. His finger hovered above a sector marked in red. Third Army? Another officer checked a folder. Intelligence summaries, movement reports, reconnaissance photographs analyzed and cross-referenced. Still here. No significant displacement. The first officer's hand stopped moving. Then who? Canadians. Silence dropped like a curtain. Not because the answer was unexpected, because it meant they'd been wrong, completely wrong. For 3 weeks, German command had positioned reserves based on one assumption, that Patton would exploit any weakness the moment it appeared. Entire battalions had been held in readiness, not because intelligence indicated an imminent threat from Third Army, but because Patton's presence demanded it. They had defended against him, while someone else moved. One officer spoke quietly, his voice barely cutting through the tension. If Patton coordinated this breakthrough, the exploitation will come faster than we can reposition. No one answered, because no one knew if that was true, or if it even mattered anymore. Allied headquarters, Normandy sector. The cable arrived during morning briefings. Standard routing, multiple approvals, the kind of communication that moved through channels without raising attention, until someone read it carefully. General George S. Patton had positioned the Canadian breakthrough within the context of his operations. Not loudly, not crudely, there was no boast, no claim that diminished Canadian casualties or courage, just strategic framing. The Canadians had succeeded, Patton's summary suggested, because Third Army's aggressive posture had forced German commanders into a defensive stance. Enemy reserves had been tied down, anticipating American exploitation. The breakthrough occurred because the operational environment had been shaped correctly, by him. The logic was airtight, plausible, impossible to disprove without appearing petty. Aides moved through headquarters, exchanging glances. Some expected immediate correction, others understood the political cost. Patton's reputation carried weight. Contradicting him now, while momentum finally favored the Allies, risked fracturing command unity. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk. The cable lay flat in front of him. He read it once. Then again. His expression didn't change. He placed the document carefully to the side, picked up the next briefing summary, continued working through the morning's operational updates without comment. No correction was issued, no clarification sent, no directive to revise the record. Officers waited for a response that never came. Hours passed, then a full day. The silence stretched long enough that some began interpreting it as tacit approval. Patton, informed of the headquarters reaction by an aide, nodded slowly. "Timing," he said. "Histories are written by those who understand it." Eisenhower said nothing, not to his staff, not in official correspondence, not even privately, where ambiguity might have been resolved. And in that silence, deliberate, calculated, unbroken, something shifted. Not on the battlefield, in the story being constructed around it. The twist was not that Patton claimed credit. It was that the enemy had already given it to him, before Patton ever said a word. German intelligence files, recovered years later from captured headquarters, revealed something unexpected. In the weeks before the Canadian breakthrough, enemy analysts had been tracking Third Army obsessively. Reconnaissance flights prioritized Patton's sectors. Communications intercepts focused on his command frequencies. Operational briefings devoted entire sections to anticipating his next move. When the Canadians advanced, German commanders didn't see an independent operation. They saw preparation. A fixing action designed to pin forces in place while Patton maneuvered for the decisive blow elsewhere. This wasn't speculation. It was written into their orders. One German intelligence assessment, dated 3 days before the breakthrough, stated, "Canadian activity likely diversionary. Primary threat remains Third Army rapid exploitation. Recommend maintaining reserve, posture, pending clarity on Patton's operational intent." Reserves were held back. Not because evidence suggested an American attack was imminent. Because doctrine required preparing for Patton to do what he always did, move faster than intelligence could track. So when the Canadians broke through, enemy commanders repositioned, away from the breach, toward sectors where they expected Patton to capitalize on the chaos. They pulled divisions from the Canadian front. They reinforced positions Patton wasn't targeting. They prepared for an attack that wasn't coming and ignored the one that was. The Canadians pushed deeper, encountered weakened resistance, advanced faster than their own planners had projected. By the time German intelligence corrected its assessment, the front had already shifted. Reinforcements couldn't arrive in time. Defensive lines couldn't be re-established. The breakthrough succeeded. Not because Patton created the conditions, but because the enemy believed he had so completely that they defended against a ghost and left the real threat uncontested. Patton hadn't distorted the narrative after the battle. The enemy had done it for him before the first shot was fired. The question wasn't whether German commanders overestimated Patton. It was why they had no choice. War is built on prediction. Intelligence systems exist to reduce uncertainty. Doctrine converts patterns into decisions. Commanders rely on knowing what comes next, not perfectly, but well enough to position forces before chaos arrives. Patton broke that system, not through deception, through speed. He moved faster than intelligence could update, faster than reinforcements could deploy, faster than enemy commanders could convene and agree on a response. In Sicily, he reached Palermo before German officers confirmed he'd even started the offensive. In France, his tank columns appeared in sectors enemy maps showed as rear areas. The problem wasn't that he was unpredictable, it was that he was consistently faster than the cycle of observe, assess, decide, act. By the time enemy intelligence confirmed his location, he'd already moved. By the time reserves were dispatched, he'd already broken through. By the time new orders were issued, the situation had changed again. German doctrine relied on tempo. Patton operated outside it, so enemy planners adapted the only way they could. They stopped reacting to where he was. They started anticipating where he might go, and that anticipation required holding forces in reserve, maintaining defensive depth, never fully committing to engagements elsewhere, because Patton might appear at any moment. He didn't need to be everywhere. He needed the enemy to believe he could be. One German intelligence summary, filed weeks before the Canadian breakthrough, noted, "Third Army movements suggest preparation for rapid exploitation. Timing unclear. Recommend maintaining reserve posture across all sectors until intent confirmed." That recommendation froze decisions. It kept divisions waiting. It created gaps. And into those gaps, others moved. Then Patton disappeared. The sidelining was public enough to notice. Political pressure, command friction, the kind of tension that builds when personalities clash and victories don't erase past controversies. Patton was reassigned, temporarily removed from frontline command. Third Army remained in position, but its commander was no longer directing operations. German intelligence noted the change within days. Reports circulated quickly. Analysts updated assessments. Briefings adjusted threat priorities. And for the first time in weeks, enemy commanders felt something they hadn't allowed themselves before. Relief. Not celebration, not confidence. just the absence of constant anticipation. Reserves could be reassigned. Defensive lines could be thinned in sectors where Patton was no longer a factor. Forces held back for contingencies that never materialized could finally be deployed where they were immediately needed. The operational tempo slowed. Decisions that had been delayed, waiting to see what Patton would do, could now proceed. One German staff officer wrote in a private memo, "Threat posture reduced. Third Army command transition suggests operational pause. Recommend reallocation to priority sectors." Divisions moved. Gaps opened elsewhere. And the Canadians advanced again. This time, there was no confusion about who was responsible. Canadian forces pushed through weakened defenses. Enemy commanders scrambled to respond, but reinforcements were already committed elsewhere. The breakthrough widened. It should have been the end of the story. Patton removed. Canadians advancing independently. Credit impossible to misattribute. Except the maps never stopped circling his name. Patton wasn't commanding, but enemy planning still bent around him. It started subtly. Intelligence reports continued tracking Third Army positions, even with Patton sidelined. Reconnaissance flights still prioritized his sectors. Analysts still filed assessments on potential movements, contingencies, scenarios that assumed his return. Because everyone knew the sidelining was temporary, and temporary meant planning had to account for what came next. So reserves stayed in position, not fully committed, not redeployed, just waiting. Waiting for Patton to return, waiting for Third Army to move, waiting for the attack that would come the moment he resumed command. The anticipation became operational paralysis. Decisions that should have been straightforward, reinforcing collapsing sectors, consolidating defensive lines, were delayed because commanders couldn't ignore the possibility that Patton's absence was deliberate. A feint, a deception designed to draw forces away before he struck somewhere unexpected. One German division commander refused to commit his armor to a deteriorating position, writing, "Movement premature until Third Army intent clarified. Recommend holding current posture." His tanks stayed in reserve. The position collapsed without them. Another commander requested permission to redeploy artillery assets to support units under heavy pressure. Permission was denied. Maintain coverage of Third Army sectors. Patton's status unconfirmed. The guns stayed silent, and while enemy forces waited for an attack that wasn't coming, the Canadians kept moving, pushing deeper, exploiting gaps that existed not because of tactical failures, but because the enemy had positioned itself to counter a threat that was no longer on the battlefield. They weren't fighting Patton anymore. They were fighting the idea of him. And ideas, unlike divisions, couldn't be pinned on a map. Eisenhower had access to something no one else did. Reports from signals intelligence, communications intercepts that revealed not just enemy positions, but enemy reasoning. He knew the Germans were fixated on Patton. He knew they were holding reserves in anticipation of his return. He knew they were misattributing Canadian successes to Patton's indirect pressure, and he knew that correcting the narrative publicly would have saved the enemy. The moment Allied headquarters clarified that Patton was sidelined, truly, operationally sidelined, German commanders would have redeployed immediately. Reserves would move. Defensive lines would consolidate. The gaps the Canadians were exploiting would close. So Eisenhower said nothing. Not to the press, not in official communiques, not even internally, where clarity might have prevented future misattribution. He let the ambiguity persist, let the enemy believe Patton was still a factor, let them keep divisions in reserve, waiting for an attack that would never come. It wasn't about protecting Patton's reputation. It was about protecting operational advantage. The enemy's misunderstanding was worth more than the truth. One intelligence summary, marked for Eisenhower's review only, concluded, "Enemy force allocation suggests persistent concern. Third Army exploitation. Recommend maintaining operational ambiguity regarding command transitions." Eisenhower initialed the page, "No further comment." The Canadians continued advancing, and the enemy continued waiting. Weeks later, when Patton returned to command, German intelligence assumed the pause had been deliberate, that the sidelining had been cover, that everything since had been preparation. They repositioned again, anticipating the next move, and by the time they realized they'd been defending against momentum that no longer existed, the front had collapsed. Not because of Patton, because they'd never stopped believing he was coming. Patton returned. Third Army moved, not cautiously, not gradually, fast. Columns pushed forward before enemy intelligence could confirm the offensive had even started. Breakthroughs occurred in sectors commanders had reinforced, then abandoned, then reinforced again, trying to anticipate where he'd strike. Orders contradicted previous orders. Reinforcements were dispatched, recalled, redirected. Defensive lines collapsed not because they were weak, but because no one knew where to hold them. Time compressed. The gap between observation and decision shrank until it vanished. By the time enemy commanders confirmed Patton's location, he'd already moved past it. By the time reserves arrived, the breakthrough had shifted elsewhere. Doctrine required processing information before acting. Patton never gave them time to process. German staff officers filed reports that read like confusion translated into military language. Enemy movement faster than assessment cycle permits. Third Army advance confirmed in sectors previously reported secure. Request clarification. Current disposition contradicts updated intelligence. No clarification came, because the situation was already different. One division commander wrote in his final report before capture, "Attempted consolidation. Enemy arrived during repositioning. No time to establish defense." Another noted simply, "Orders overtaken by events." The front didn't hold. It dissolved. Not because of firepower, because no one could decide where to fight. Victory was secured. Patton's role was undeniable now, but the story wasn't finished. The meeting occurred days after the breakthrough. No record was kept, no aides present, just Eisenhower and Patton, in a room where the maps had already been updated and the next phase of operations planned. What was said has never been confirmed. No memoir recorded it. No diary entry survived. Officers who saw Patton before the meeting described him as confident, assured, carrying himself the way men do when they know history will remember their name. Officers who saw him afterward said he was quieter, not subdued, not diminished, just different. One aide recalled Patton saying, days later, that Eisenhower had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That wars aren't won twice, once on the battlefield and once in memory. He never elaborated. Within weeks, official summaries began circulating, operational reports, command briefings, the kind of documentation that would eventually feed historians and archivists. The Canadian breakthrough was attributed clearly. Patton's role was acknowledged, but reframed. Not as the architect of the victory, but as one element in a broader operational success. The language was careful. No one was contradicted. No one was diminished. But the emphasis had shifted, quietly, precisely, without announcement. German intelligence analysts, reviewing captured documents after the war, noted the change. One wrote, "Allied post-action reporting attributes, breakthrough to Canadian operational execution. Third Army role described as consequential, but not primary." Another observed, "Narrative adjustment suggests internal command friction regarding credit allocation." They didn't understand what had happened in that room, but they understood the outcome. History had been rewritten, not loudly, not publicly, just enough. Years after the war, German officers were interviewed, some by historians, some by military analysts studying decision-making under pressure. They were asked about Allied operations, about specific battles, about commanders whose reputations had grown into legends, and they were asked about the Canadian breakthrough. One former intelligence officer paused before answering. "We expected Patton," he said. We positioned for him. We held reserves because we believed he would exploit any opening, and while we waited, the Canadians moved. He was asked if Patton's reputation had distorted their response. Yes. He was asked if they would have responded differently had they known Patton wasn't the threat. Yes. He was asked if they believed Patton had been responsible for the breakthrough. He hesitated. At the time, we did. Later, reviewing the operations? No. The Canadians earned that victory, but we gave it to them because we were defending against someone who wasn't there. Another officer, when asked about Allied command decisions during that period, said something unexpected. Eisenhower understood something we didn't. What? That belief moves faster than orders. And if you control what the enemy believes, you don't need to control the battlefield. He was asked if he thought Eisenhower had deliberately allowed the misattribution. He smiled. I don't know, but if he did, it was the smartest decision of the campaign. The Canadians never campaigned for recognition. Their commanders filed reports. Their units were reorganized. Their casualties were mourned quietly. Patton's reputation grew, then became controversial, then solidified into something historians still debate. Eisenhower's legacy hardened into something steadier, not as loud, not as dramatic, but respected by those who understood what leadership actually required. Decades later, a historian researching the campaign found a draft communiqué in an archive. It had been written shortly after the breakthrough, intended for release to the press. Patton's name appeared prominently. The Canadians were mentioned, but briefly. Someone had crossed out a paragraph and rewritten it in pen. The revision attributed the breakthrough explicitly to Canadian command decisions under fire. The handwriting was identified. Eisenhower's. No explanation accompanied the change. No memo justified it. Just ink. The question remains unanswered, not because evidence is missing, because the answer exists in a room no one else entered. What did Eisenhower say when Patton claimed credit? Did he threaten him? Did he warn him? Or did he do something more dangerous, let Patton believe the story was his, while ensuring history would never fully agree? The truth stayed behind that door, and it never came out, but the outcome is visible, in the records that survived, in the revisions that weren't announced, in the way the story shifted, just enough, without anyone noticing it happening. Power doesn't require speeches. It requires knowing when silence is more effective than correction, when ambiguity protects advantage, when letting others believe something false serves a purpose greater than truth. The guns went silent, the front collapsed, victory was declared, and somewhere, in a room no historian ever accessed, a conversation occurred that shaped how that victory would be remembered. Not immediately, not dramatically, but permanently. The question isn't what Eisenhower said, it's why he didn't need to say it publicly.